Now this is the part we've all been waiting for. Dr. Erica Holmes. Yay! And Dr. Holmes has been so generous with her time, being our resident mental health professional here to help anybody throughout the 2 days, which is such a generous thing for you to have done, to be working on your days off. I'm not going to make a big introduction, except to say I love this woman. And how do I say this? I'm not always greatly loved by the mental health profession, especially as I'm always advocating for survivors' voices and, you know, the whole we have power too thing. But the person who gets this most that I've ever met, one of the people, is Dr. Holmes. And she's always encouraged me and never made me feel smaller or less than, because I don't have a Psych D. And I don't teach in a university. So her generosity of heart, her true survivor wisdom and insight irradiates everything she does. And I think we've saved the best to last.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lou. It's amazing how people are brought together. And I don't believe that things happen by accident. And I know that Louise and I forming a friendship was not by accident. And I believe there's much more to come from our friendship. So thank you all for staying this afternoon. I know the rain is coming down, and those of us who are basically Los Angeles natives know that when it rains, that means we're supposed to shut down and not come out of the house, right? So I really appreciate you all staying. I want to let you know that this is going to be a little difficult for me, so I'm going to disclose that because I have an hour. And some of my closest friends often try to tell me that I talk a lot. I don't believe it. But sometimes even conversations I can have for 2.5 hours. So to present the material that I want to present to you for this hour is going to be a little difficult, but I am going to do my best. I will make sure that I stay on time. So some things I might have to go through a little quicker. Just for time's sake, so that we can all get out of here and then face our rainy LA commute, which I'm sure none of us are ready to run towards or wanting to run towards. So bear with me. I'm going to talk about dating and intimacy after trauma. And after the presentation, I have some books that are for sale and that have been on the table for the 2 days of the conference. And so if anyone has bought a book, one of my books, there's going to be a brief book signing where I will sign your book before you leave. And so we're going to stay on time to make sure that that happens. And so the book, this current book that is for sale now, has one chapter on trauma. There will be hopefully within the next year another book that I will publish that will focus specifically on intimacy and intimacy and connection after trauma. And so this presentation is really focused towards the work that I'm doing now. So of course, as a mental health clinician, I always want to start off with a trigger warning. Some of us have been here for 2 days. Some of us have been here all day. And so we know that, there might be things that are said that might be upsetting. We have a regulation room that I would ask for you to make use of that and to do what you need to do in order to take care of yourself as we move forward. So dating and intimacy after trauma. How did I get into this work? I am a clinical psychologist. I've been working as a clinical psychologist since 2001. I saw my first client in 1998. And I have many stories, but I want to tell you the story of Tammy, which really inspired me to focus on this work. So quickly, how do I quickly describe Tammy? Tammy was came into therapy as a 31-year-old African-American woman who had been recently divorced. She was very successful in her life by most of the measures that we use. She had finished college and graduate school. She had managed to buy a house in Los Angeles. She had great friends, a really close and appropriate relationship with her family, and overall was a really happy, kind of well-adjusted person. But she came into therapy. She had been divorced for about 2 years, and she came into therapy under the suggestion of her friend. And so when asked, why did you come into therapy? And she was like, I don't know. I was talking to my friend and disclosed that I was going through a divorce or had gone through a divorce. And the friend at that time, which was maybe about 5 months after separating from her husband, who she had been married to for 9 years. So she was talking to the friend, and the friend said, so how are you doing? And Tammy's response was like, oh, I'm fine. And so the friend was like, oh, I'm really surprised because I didn't know you two were even having problems that would lead to divorce. And Tammy said, well, I wouldn't say that there were really problems. I just decided that we weren't going in the same direction. And so, decided that I would get divorced. And so Tammy's friend at that point thought that there was something a little strange about her. Oh, after 9 years, I'm getting divorced and I'm fine. And it took Tammy about 1.5 years after that to actually decide to come to therapy because she said, well, I don't know, might be good just to go and talk to someone. So when Tammy comes in, she says, all of those things and talks about how great her life is. And she was like, yeah, my friend said because I really didn't have any feelings around being divorced that maybe I should come and talk to someone. And so after being in therapy for a brief while, as a therapist, there were questions around, okay, what's going on? It seems like all of these areas of Tammy's life are like right on point, but there's something very detached about this intimate relationship that she has let go of. And so I began to explore with Tammy her history. And so some of the history that she told me, and I'm going to fast forward, was about this great extended family that she had and that she loved very much. And then she began to talk about her family was not in the state of California. They were down south, and it was just her immediate family that had moved to California when she was very young. So I asked her to tell me what was her earliest memory, and all of her early memories were her joy and fun and the love that she received from her extended family when she lived down south. And then I said, and tell me your first scary or sad or difficult memory. And she said, now this was probably 6 months into therapy. She's really coming in using therapy. It's just let's talk about things because things are great. So this is about 6 months into therapy. And so she says, well, I do have this one experience, and she begins to cry, and she says, when I was 4 years old, she said she was born into a big family. Her mother was one of 10, her father was one of 9. She was born in a multi-generational household, and she was the first child to be born, and she was everybody's baby. And at 4 years old, her mother decided to move she and her older brother to California. And they moved to California, and so she says that she remembered this transition from this southern country communal upbringing and raising to coming to the inner city of Los Angeles in the 70s to a one-bedroom a house with just she, her mother, and her brother. And at 4, not understanding distance. So how far am I from my grandmother? Not understanding what it meant to move. The only thing that she understood was that all the people that she had learned to love were gone. except her mother and her brother. And that wasn't as upsetting because she had her mother and her brother, even though she missed her extended family. And then her mother went to work. And so she says she remembers, and at this point she starts to sob, that her mother took her to daycare at 4. And she didn't understand the concept because she had never been cared for anyone outside of the home. And that the image in her mind was, and she's 32 at this point, she remembered that her mother had on a black dress and walked out of the door. And for her, her mother was disappearing in the same way that her grandmother and her aunts and her grandfather and her cousins did. For her, at that moment, everyone that she had loved and depended on and who had nurtured her was gone. And that was the only thing that she felt, that she remembered feeling for that entire day. Now, of course, the end of the day, her mother came and picked her up, and they went about life, and this happened every day. And after a year, she and her brother begged her mother to send her and her brother back to the South, which her mother was like, I didn't know it was going to be this, hard on you two. Sent them back, and the mother would come and visit, and they stayed back for about 3 years, they lived in the South until the grandmother got sick. And so I asked, after Tammy disclosed that history, and as I said, she was sobbing and began to cry, I asked Tammy, how does that little girl show up today? How does that little girl show up in your relationships today? If that 4-year-old thought that everyone who I loved and depended on was gone or would leave or could disappear, how does she show up today? And that was the entry point at which we began to explore her attachment trauma. That is the point at which we could examine why being married to what she describes as a wonderful guy and deciding, I'm going to go ahead and just leave, why that was so simple for her. Because what she had internalized was that people leave. So there's no need for connection. Because she had gone from this huge family system to this 3-person system, she, her mother, and her brother, in her mind, the only people who would remain were her mother and brother. So her intimacy was only reserved for them. And everyone else was an option. Does that make sense? So no, Tammy, that's my story. I'm Tammy. And it wasn't until I was validated for that experience, because it wasn't a physical assault, it wasn't a sexual assault. I didn't grow up in an abusive home. I didn't grow up with an abandoning mother. I grew up with a mother and brother who loved me and a family who loved me. So there was no acknowledgement for that ripped away part of my family. That for all of those years, I learned to survive believing that the only people that I could depend on or connect with or give myself to were those 2 people who stayed with me, who were, of course, living their own lives, but prevented me from living mine. And so in looking at that, kind of springboarded my work and me beginning to reflect on that attachment trauma that happened when I was 4, and not really, besides, racial oppression, that small thing, and right, and gender oppression, and growing up in a community where it was community violence. There's no kind of interpersonal violence directed towards me. If The way that I constructed my beliefs about intimacy and trust around that event was so strong, unacknowledged and unhealed for so many years. How are other women who have been continuously victimized or brutally victimized and not necessarily supported by anyone, how are they then processing trust, connection, intimacy? And so that's how I got into the work of looking at that residual symptom that is often not talked about as much. How, as we are recovering from our trauma, whether acknowledged or not, how has that impacted the way that we connect and commit to others, that we allow others to be a true part of our life? So when we define intimacy, and this is so important. So intimacy comes from the Latin word intimus, meaning inner or most. And so intimacy refers to sharing that which is the innermost parts of ourselves. And so we can have friends and, platonic friends and coworkers and laugh and get together even with family and friends. But what happens when we get into a intimate relationship that demands the innermost parts of ourselves? That we are more vulnerable with that individual than we are required to be in any other relationship in our lives. So intimacy goes beyond the niceties of friendship. Intimacy goes deeper than being cordial and even available. Intimacy says that I will trust you enough to share the innermost parts of myself. And oftentimes, when we experience trauma, that is a huge part of ourselves that we don't allow anyone to have anymore, because it is scary and it is painful. So intimate relationships. So again, talking about what is intimacy and what do intimate relationships provide. With family, with friends, with partners, that emotional attachment, which is necessary for human beings, emotional availability, emotional vulnerability, and need fulfillment are all things that we can't get from anyone, are all things that we can't give to ourselves. So there are a lot of things that we can give to ourselves, but attachment is not one of those, right? Being emotionally available, or having someone be emotionally available to for us, or emotional vulnerability, or fulfilling our needs, things that we can't get from that we can't give to ourselves, but those things that are important for us to get from other people. So what is trauma? And I'm just going to do a quick review because I'm quite sure most of us have heard this before. So trauma is an experience that is real or perceived that threatens life or body integrity or psychological integrity. Now, as Lou mentioned, the psychological field can be a little unwelcoming to anyone who is not degreed or studied in psychology formally. And I think that actually is part of what keeps psychology 10 years behind what those of us who work on the front lines are doing or know, right? So for the psychological community, we are, for example, someone's working in the community and they say, hey, this is a thing. And the psychological community is like, no, it's not a thing until we prove it's a thing. So then they go for 10 years and try to prove it's a thing, and then they say, yes, it's a thing, when we've been working with the thing that we identified for 10 years. And now there's a new thing. It's 10 years. There's a new thing. And so we know more about it because we're waiting for them to do the research to prove that it's a thing. When you're working with people, or you're living amongst people, or you're talking to people, you know that this is a thing. And so I like to talk about trauma and the impact of trauma as it relates to both threats to physical and psychological integrity, because as of this point, for example, the DSM, which is what we use to diagnose, does not recognize the threat to psychological integrity. So when you give a diagnosis of PTSD, criteria A says that there is real or threatened death, real or threatened bodily injury, or real or threatened sexual assault. Those are three types of experiences that the DSM recognizes, the DSM-5 recognizes as criteria A for PTSD. And if a person has not experienced those three things, then you can't even look at the rest of criteria for PTSD. So when someone experiences a threat to psychological integrity from a DSM standpoint, they actually can't get a diagnosis of PTSD in and of itself. So think about the child who's ripped out of their home going into foster care. That's not trauma? You can't have nightmares, flashbacks, intrusion, hypervigilance. You can't have any of that? So anyway, see, I can get on my high horse and it'll be 5 o'clock. Anyway, so yes, we include psychological integrity as a traumatic experience, of course. And or that this has happened to the individual themselves or someone that they love. And as Lou said yesterday, also the next portion of that is that it overwhelms a person's usual way of coping. And I overheard some of the groups, and I heard individuals talking about the subjective nature of a traumatic experience. That a traumatic experience cannot be defined solely by an objective measure. That there was a threat to body or a physical or psychological integrity. That's the objective component. But the subjective, and then how did I respond to that? How did my system respond to that? So there has to be that overwhelming my usual way of coping, or the way that I would experience that. So the only thing that I'll talk about here with the brain is that, this physiological nature, that what overwhelms my sense or my usual way of coping is this, and I'm quite sure many of you have heard it, so I won't go into detail, but, the fight, flight, or freeze response, what happens with the brain stem, the limbic system, and the frontal lobe. Right? So when the body perceives a threat, the brain stem starts to activate those systems that say you need to fight, flight, or freeze. So it tells the body, get ready. Sends that message to the middle part of the brain that releases or sends signals to release the stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, to get ready to fight or run or freeze in order to take care of oneself. So when that happens, this frontal lobe that's responsible for long-term planning and analytics, you don't need that. So it goes offline to send all of the necessary resources to that fight, flight, or freeze that is happening in the limbic system. What's important about that middle part of the brain is that it stimulates the amygdala, which is on the side of the brain housed in the limbic system. And the amygdala is what we know as the fear center or the emotional center of the brain. So every time the fight, flight, or freeze body response is triggered, it triggers the body's fear response. And so in the amygdala, fear is not the only thing that's housed there. Fear, love, warmth, caring, nurturing, connection is housed there. So what happens and what can happen in a trauma response is that the brain gets conditioned to a fear response. And so even those things that might seem as neutral stimuli to us or even positive stimuli to others, when someone has experienced trauma, and I'm going to talk a little bit about relational trauma, but when someone has experienced trauma, that amygdala is basically on fire and primed for fear. So now something that others might interpret as neutral or even positive, the brain that's been impacted by trauma interprets as a threat or dangerous. How might this thing hurt me? And so there's an event The brain interprets that event as danger, and that interpretation may be accurate or somewhat inaccurate. The HPA system, which is that fight, flight, or freeze, comes online, and the person experiences a fight, flight, submit, or freeze response. And submit generally happens in kind of trauma bonding or when someone is held in captivity or over long periods of time. So how does this relate to trauma, interpersonal trauma, and connection and intimacy? So when we think about traumas, we think about them really in two major categories, and that's impersonal and interpersonal. Impersonal are those traumas that occur kind of as a natural occurrence. They're not the result of people. Generally, those are the results of kind of acts of nature. An earthquake, a tornado, those kinds of things. Most of us in our lifetime, if we've experienced trauma, tend to be interpersonal trauma. So interpersonal trauma is that trauma that occurs between people or from person to person, where there is an identified perpetrator, and it happens to individual or multiple victims. And I like to think about, even though the literature hasn't started talking about this, so this is you guys are on the cutting edge. Oftentimes, currently what we see in the literature is really two categories of interpersonal trauma, relational and attachment. But I also believe that we need to look at the differences between innominate trauma, relational, and attachment. And the way that I define or differentiate the three, innominate trauma is that trauma that occurs person to person by someone who is unknown to the victim. So this is a stranger. If you are in a bank and the bank is held up. If you are walking down the street and someone snatches your purse. You've never met this person, they carjack you. It's a crime of opportunity. You don't know who they are. You don't know, you might not be able to describe them, or you can. And that's differentiated between relational trauma, because relational trauma is the trauma that occurs person to person by someone who you are in relationship with, someone who you know, someone who often there's been an unspoken agreement that we will be relational, we will be cordial to each other. So anything from being cordial, to we are dating, to we are married. So I'm in a relationship with you in some way. A boss, a coworker, a classmate, a colleague on the sports team. Anyone, someone that I'm dating, someone that I'm marrying, someone that I'm, having one night stands with. We know each other, we're in a relationship. And the third is attachment trauma. And I think of attachment trauma and differentiate it from relational trauma in that the trauma occurs with an attachment, a primary attachment figure, and this is generally from child to parent or child to caregiver, which is different from relational trauma, where in relational trauma there might or might not be a power differential. An inherent power differential in the relationship. If we're dating, there's not an inherent power differential, although there could be gender power differentials. But we've agreed we're going to date, and there's an agreement that we're in this relationship and not an inherent power differential. However, in attachment trauma, there's an inherent power differential. There's an inherent power differential, and I am dependent on my attachment figure for survival of my psychological self and also survival of my physical self. Because children can't take care of themselves. They can't feed themselves. They can't pay their own rent. And I'm a child. I don't know who I am. So I'm looking to you to tell me who I am and what I deserve. And so when you look at innominate trauma, it's an interpersonal trauma, and I'm like, I don't know what to expect from the world. The world is crazy. Like, I'm just walking down the street and someone assaulted me. That is one kind of way of thinking about and trying to make sense of what has happened. But I argue when the perpetrator is someone that you know, that you have a relationship with, whether it is a power dynamic relationship or whether it's a reciprocal relationship, there is inherent trust in those relationships. And when that person perpetrates trauma or violence against you, whether intended or unintended, that inherent trust that we must have from person to person, that is the first thing that a child learns before they can speak, is, can I trust my parent to be available for me? Can I trust my parent to feed me when I'm hungry? Can I trust my parent? And this is what I should expect from parents and adults. So when that is broken, then I begin to not only say this world is crazy, and people are doing all kinds of things that are horrible to other people, but I begin to say that there must be something wrong with me, or this wouldn't have happened to me, because they loved and trusted. We were supposed to love and trust each other. But maybe there's something wrong with you, so maybe I can't trust the people who say they're available to me. And this world then is not safe or trustworthy. So there begins to be this triad of trying to understand yourself, the other person, and the world we live in as in relationship to this traumatic experience. So I love this quote by Bruce Perry. He says, "Fire can warm or consume. Water can quench or drown. Wind can caress or cut. And so it is with the human relationships. We can both create and destroy, nurture and terrorize, traumatize and heal each other." That it is the strength of that human relationship that can dictate the ways in which we move throughout the world, that we develop, and the ways in which we connect with ourselves, with others, and with our communities. So how does trauma then impact intimacy and relationships? So I'm going to use some of the 4 areas that we know are impacted when someone experiences trauma, and 4 major categories or clusters of symptoms. So after a traumatic experience, some of the symptoms are re-experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, intrusion of memories, avoidance, not wanting to feel the feelings around that experience, not wanting to have reminders of the experience, so avoiding places, people, things, smells, or sounds that remind us of that experience, not wanting to talk about it. I want to avoid thinking about it. I want to avoid talking about it. I want to avoid seeing about it. I want to avoid hearing about it. So that avoidance. Hyperarousal, that's that fight, flight, or freeze, so that sympathetic nervous system being easily startled, anxious, nervous. And the last one is negative cognition and mood. The development of negative cognition and mood, which is where I kind of hang my hat on the symptom that really intrudes upon our ability to be connected after trauma. So how do we begin to internalize or develop an understanding of what this experience of trauma means to me, what it means, what can I expect from myself, from other people, and from the world? But each of the symptoms can impact relationships and relationship development. And so, for example, re-experiencing symptoms can create distance between the survivor and others. So if I'm having intrusions, I'm not connected to other people, I might try to then begin to avoid them, or I might, my flashbacks might scare people. Avoidance, I can cut myself off emotionally from others because I'm trying to avoid anything that reminds me of the trauma, and so I begin to develop avoidance behaviors around anything that might remind me of the trauma. So certain voices, certain smells, certain experiences, and also being connected. If the trauma occurred in a relationship of trust, then I could begin to develop avoidance of anything that resembles trust, even if it's a safe or healthy trust in some ways. Hyperarousal. So hyperarousal can contribute to increased conflict or aggression. So if you're always in fight, flight, or freeze, you're ready to fight or you're ready to flee. So you can be hyper aroused and it causes aggression. You could also be hyper aroused and it causes you to shut down because you're flooded. And negative cognition and mood, again, this is where I hang my hat, creates disconnection from self, others, and the world. And so this is a cognitive triad of traumatic stress. That in traumatic stress, it impacts your views of the world, your views of yourself, and your views about the future. And this triad, some of the quotes, the things in quotation marks under each, are just examples of some of the negative cognition and mood that can be created or that people might develop as they're healing from their trauma. So what are the thoughts and the cognitions that the person has about themselves in relation to this experience of trauma, about others or views about others in relationship to this experience of trauma, and views about the future or the world? So themselves, I'm incompetent, I should have reacted differently, so that kind of self-blaming. Views about the future, and that includes the future of others. Things will never be the same. Other people are dangerous. People will never love me in the way that I deserve to be loved. And things about the world is dangerous. Now, what's very... I'll say sneaky. What's very sneaky about negative cognitions is that they're not readily seen. Unlike re-experiencing or hypervigilance or even avoidance, they may go under the radar because these are the quiet things that we're saying to ourselves that we might not even pay a lot of attention to or acknowledge, are quietly being spoken to ourselves. However, they're showing up in the ways that we are connecting or not connecting with others. They're showing up in the choices that we make. Our choices are demonstrating some of the things that we're feeling about ourselves on the inside. And so this just shows trauma effects holistically. So what does the research tell us about some of the difficulties that survivors can experience after a traumatic incident or experience? Difficulties with trust, of course. Not only not trusting others or having difficulty trusting others, but also having difficulty trusting yourself. Can I trust my own choices? Can I trust my own intuition? Can I trust my own beliefs? Fear that it might happen again, fear that I might not be able to protect myself, fear that others would be able to see that that was my experience just by me showing up, fear that others might say that I'm different so they know that something has happened to me or is different about me. So a whole constellation of fears. Difficulties controlling or regulating emotions. If your body is in a fight, flight, or freeze kind of loop, then that amygdala is on fire, which houses emotions. So when a person experiences the emotions, they may be on a 10 all the time because that amygdala is ready to fight, fight, or flee. Fight, flee, or freeze. 3 F's. So difficulty establishing interpersonal boundaries. Where do I end and you begin, or where do you end and where do I begin? Can I say no? Or on the other end of the spectrum, do I say no too much? How am I holding my world together, right? Or not holding it together because I don't believe that I can anyway. When we were talking yesterday, one of the things that Louise, in her presentation, she's like, let's talk about our superpowers. So everyone turn to what's your superpower? So what characteristic did you develop as an adaptation to your experience of trauma? And and that was your superpower because it helped you to survive. It helped you to get to this point. And so I had my table laughing because I was like, I've embraced mine, and I've embraced it with humor, control. When I was 4, there was no control. I couldn't say, don't take me from my family. And my mother did what she thought was best. And when I look at my life, if I would have grown up in the 12,000 person, 2 stoplights in a Walmart town, I don't know, if I would have been able to have the experiences and see my life going this way. So she did it, and she's doing what she thought was best for her children and her family. But at 4, I had no control to say, I want to stay with my big mama. And so I learned how to control the things that I could, which was myself and everybody else around me. And believe me, some people that I had close to me would remind me often. My friend bought me a plaque that said, Erica, the plaque says, you're not bossy, you're just helpful. And I was like, see, you get me. You get me. But, those boundaries, my boundaries and what I established was the last one, passive or over controlling, was I'm going to control my world, because there was a time when I could not control my world. And I know in talking to many survivors, regardless of the type of trauma, the hallmark of trauma is that feeling of helplessness. And so there are many survivors who then develop this over-controlling nature in multiple parts of their lives. I am going to never feel like I'm out of control anymore. So how do we move past that? So then how do all of these things play into, not play into dating after trauma, but how do we begin to work through some of those symptoms that are continued after we experience trauma? So we need to take an inventory of the lasting impact of the trauma on our life. So what are the symptoms that we still have? I know in working with a lot of people that once they have calmed down that central nervous system and they're not having flashbacks anymore, they're not hyper aroused anymore, their sleep is stable, they're not really thinking about it anymore, for them, the work is done. And so many people miss that third stage that Judith Herman talks about and that Lou went over yesterday, that reconnection. What I've found is often that stage is the most neglected. We think reconnection is, okay, go back and get some friends and find a spiritual self. And then once you get some friends, you'll be reconnected. But there's never an exploration of how connected are you in those friendships? How vulnerable are you in those friendships? How available are you in those friendships? Or how vulnerable are you in those friendships to allow your friends to be connected to you and available for you? Because as a controller, I can help you all day long, but I don't need help. I got it under control because that's what I do. So there's not a true connection if I can't go to my friend and say, I'm hurt, I'm in pain, and I need you. Right? So what are the lasting symptoms, or what's the lasting impact of that trauma? Physiological, psychological, emotional. Engage in activities to calm the hyperarousal, and I would go further and say engage in activities to calm hyperarousal and make it a daily practice. Have things that you can do daily, have things that you can do in a moment, and have larger things that you are more expansive things and activities that you can do when you have more time. Take stock of your emotional self. Keep an emotional journal. Do art, paint, those kinds of things. Soothe self-criticism with self-compassion. I heard yesterday people talking about affirmations. How nice are you to you? Do you say, oh my goodness, you're controlling, you're a horrible person, nobody will ever love you or be your friend? Or do you say, you know what, controlling comes in handy sometimes. I just need to keep it on track, in check. Look at how great I am. Do you ever say that? So how are you talking to yourself? Given that trauma most often occurs in relationships, healing and recovery must also occur in relationships. And I'm going to go really fast because I only have 2 minutes. So, every experience of trust, renewed relationships with others, healthy experience with others helps to rewire the brain and create new neural pathways to combat the trauma-informed pathways. So neuroplasticity is the brain's flexibility or ability to develop new neural pathways. And so with every positive experience, healthy relationship that you have, you're rewiring your brain to see relationships and vulnerability as good and healthy and appropriate. So I'm going to end on this quote. Helplessness and isolation are the core experiences of trauma. Power and reconnection are the core experiences of recovery. That it is only through empowering ourselves and reconnecting to others that we can recover from those feelings of helplessness and isolation that are the hallmark of a traumatic experience. That was me running through my presentation. Thank you. Are there any questions? Are there any questions that I can answer for you that were not answered or that came up as I was talking? Yes.
Thank you so much. How would you approach, so say if we have a partner that we feel has experienced trauma that is just completely oblivious to maybe because they left home when they were 14 or 15 and on their own and they just thought they got through it all, but you feel that, how do you help somebody maybe? I know we can only help ourselves, but what do you say to that?
So it's hard to say without knowing the person, but the one thing that I advocate is insight first or education first. So is there any way to either begin to have conversations, to provide some readings, or to expose the person to something that might educate them about the impact of trauma and the different traumas that people experience and the lasting effect. Whether it is direct, right, whether it's an overt or covert way of introducing this material. So for example, maybe there's a movie that kind of resembles some of this person's experiences. So can you have a movie night? Say, hey, let's have a movie night. And it's a movie night with a, purpose. Movies with a purpose. To maybe begin the dialogue so that it's not about that person, but just the person on the screen. So it kind of depersonalizes it and diffuses it. It's not about you, honey, friend. It's about the person that was on the screen. What do you think about that? And just start having conversations about that person on the screen rather than the person that you are with or your partner. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi. So connection is stressed a lot in the healing and recovery process. My question is, what about for trauma survivors who's maybe coping in a negative way, more addictive, at-risk behavior such as promiscuity, for example? What advice would you give a clinician working with that population?
So, and that's why, like in my work, I don't say connection, I say intimacy. Right? Because we can connect in a lot of ways, like sleeping with everybody that we meet. Like, we're connected. So that's why I say intimacy. I actually work with a lot of people and have worked with a lot of people who are survivors of trauma in various ways, where promiscuity and detached connections are a part of the way that they cope. And I'm a big advocate of not going after the negative coping, but helping to instill new coping before we take that away. And finding those areas, like from a strength-based perspective. So what are those areas that they are good at, that excite them, that they have access, because that's important. Access and resources are important. So what are some other functional ways that you can introduce before trying to take away the promiscuity? You know, there has to be education around the promiscuity, yes, but I've found that people are often not ready to let go of whatever the negative coping is until they find something else that they can hang their hat on. I think that's one of the reasons that a primary focus, or what is the word that I'm looking for, principle of AA is connecting to a higher power. Right? Because that becomes then the positive coping. If we can connect to a higher power, whatever that power is for you outside of yourself, then we can say we don't have to turn to alcohol as much. We turn to our higher power. And I don't necessarily think that it has to be a higher power, but what inherently is that person's strength? What are they bringing in? And how do we begin to put more energy into that thing? We help them to do that. And as they build that up, help them to understand the destructive nature of whatever that other unhealthy behavior is. That answers. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you all very much.